The life you're not living. Stop. Right now, before you read another word, I need you to do something radical. I need you to ask yourself a single, shattering question. Whose life are you actually living? Not the life you post about on Instagram, not the life you describe at Thanksgiving dinner when relatives ask how things are going, not the life your boss thinks you're building, or the one your parents imagined for you when you were born. I'm talking about your life, the one that exists in the quiet hours when the phone is dark and no one is watching, the dreams that surface in the space between sleep and waking, the version of yourself you catch a glimpse of when you are completely alone. For most people, and I mean the vast majority of adults walking around in this country right now, the honest answer to that question is devastating. They're not living their own life. They're living a carefully constructed performance designed to earn the approval of an audience that mostly isn't paying attention. Here's a statistic that should disturb you. The average American adult makes over 35,000 decisions every single day. Researchers estimate that a shocking number of those decisions, from what clothes to wear to whether to speak up in a meeting, to whether to chase a dream, are made not based on personal desire, but based on the imagined reaction of other people. We are, as a species, stunningly preoccupied with what others might think of us. Think about the last week of your life. How many times did you swallow an opinion because the room might push back? How many times did you wear something because it felt safe, rather than because you loved it? How many times did you scroll through someone else's highlight reel and quietly shrink the ambitions you'd been quietly nursing? How many conversations did you leave feeling vaguely ashamed of yourself? Not because you did anything wrong, but because you'd spent the entire time performing instead of connecting. Somewhere in Nashville right now, there's a songwriter with a gift that could move millions, who works a safe corporate job because her college roommate once laughed at her lyrics. Somewhere in Chicago, there's a man who hasn't ended a marriage that died years ago because he's terrified of what his parents will say at Christmas. Somewhere in a suburb of Phoenix, a teenager is deleting a video she filmed 17 times because she's afraid 12 strangers might leave a mean comment. This is not a small problem. This is not a quirk of personality. This is a civilization-wide epidemic of self-abandonment. And nobody talks about it honestly because talking about it honestly would require admitting exactly how much of our precious, irreplaceable time we've handed over to the imaginary jury of public opinion. The science, when you actually look at it, is staggering. Research from Dr. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA established that the brain processes social rejection through the same neural architecture it uses to process physical pain. When someone disapproves of you, your brain does not distinguish this from a punch in the face. The distress is chemically, neurologically identical. That's not a metaphor. That is your brain's actual response to a disapproving glance across a conference table. But here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely freeing once you understand it. That fear response was not designed for the world you actually live in. It was designed for a world that stopped existing roughly 10,000 years ago. Your ancestors lived in groups of 50 to 150 people. Social rejection in that context wasn't an emotional inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Cast out from the tribe, you faced starvation, exposure, and predators alone. Your brain developed an almost obsessive monitoring system. A constant background process running every second of every day, scanning for social threats, calculating group approval, adjusting behavior to maintain belonging. You are not broken. You are running survival software on hardware built for a world that no longer exists, and that mismatch is costing you everything. Consider the people you genuinely admire. Not the people you're supposed to admire. Not the ones with the right resumes and the polished LinkedIn profiles. The people who actually make something of this life. The musicians who create art that lasts. The entrepreneurs who disrupt entire industries. The writers whose sentences stop your breath. The leaders who genuinely change things. What do all of them share? Every single one of them at some crucial juncture stopped caring more about approval than about their work. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. Enough to ship the book that 23 agents rejected. Enough to launch the company their MBA professors called naive. Enough to keep painting in obscurity because the painting demanded to exist, regardless of whether anyone hung it on a wall. Steve Jobs was fired from his own company. Oprah Winfrey was told she was too emotionally engaged for broadcast television. Every major record label passed on the Beatles. J.K. Rowling received 12 rejection letters before a publisher's 8-year-old daughter grabbed the first chapter and refused to put it down. The lesson is not that these people were immune to judgment. The lesson is that they valued their vision more than they feared the verdict. That is the entire game. That one shift from living for others' approval to living for your own authentic truth is the difference between a life that matters and a life that passes. This book is about making that shift, not as a concept, not as inspiration that fades by Tuesday, as a permanent structural transformation in how you operate in the world. By the time you finish the final chapter, you will understand exactly how the approval trap was built inside you, why it functions the way it does, and precisely how to dismantle it, piece by piece, room by room, until you are finally, genuinely, irreversibly free. Let's begin. How the cage was built. Nobody was born this way. That's important to establish right at the start, because if you believe the approval addiction is simply part of your personality, something hardwired and permanent, you will never do what it takes to change it. You need to understand that you were taught to seek approval, and anything that was taught can be unlearned. The construction of the cage began before you had the language to describe what was happening. As a small child, you discovered very quickly that certain behaviors produced warmth, attention, and safety. When you performed to adults' expectations, you received love. When you deviated, you received withdrawal. This was not malicious in most cases. Your parents and teachers were running the same programming, passed down from their own conditioning. But the effect was devastating and cumulative. Your young brain did what young brains do. It learned. It built neural pathways that linked approval with safety and disapproval with danger. It developed exquisite sensitivity to the microsignals of other people's reactions, the slight tension in a parent's jaw, the subtle withdrawal of a teacher's warmth, the shift in the social temperature of a middle school cafeteria. You became, out of pure survival necessity, a specialist in reading rooms. By the time most Americans reach high school, the machinery is fully operational. Social comparison is constant. Identity is constructed almost entirely from external feedback. Teenagers spend extraordinary amounts of energy not on developing their authentic selves, but on managing others' perceptions of them. And then they go off to college, and then into careers, and then into relationships, carrying all of that machinery with them, usually without ever examining it at all. And then social media arrived, and it industrialized the whole process. What social media did, what it continues to do with breathtaking efficiency, is weaponize the brain's reward system. Every notification, every like, every positive comment triggers a small burst of dopamine, the same neurotransmitter that drives gambling addiction, the same chemical reward that makes slot machines so compulsively compelling. The platforms were engineered. literally engineered by teams of behavioral psychologists to maximize this loop. The result is that hundreds of millions of people now carry in their pockets a device specifically designed to make them more addicted to external validation. And most of us use it dozens, sometimes hundreds of times per day. We post something and then we check. We check again. We feel the small anxiety of insufficient response. We calibrate our next post based on what performed well. We are, functionally, running a perpetual focus group on ourselves. But the deepest damage isn't the addiction itself. The deepest damage is a specific cognitive error that the addiction produces. You begin to equate approval with truth. If people approve of what you did, you believe it was good. If they don't, you believe it was bad. You have outsourced your own judgment. And crowds, history demonstrates repeatedly, are catastrophically unreliable. The crowd that dismissed Van Gogh during his lifetime. The crowd that booed Bob Dylan when he plugged in an electric guitar. The crowd that told Henry Ford nobody would want an automobile when they could have a faster horse. There is also the phenomenon psychologists call the false self. The persona you present to the world because you believe it is what others want to see. You laugh at jokes you find hollow. You perform enthusiasm for activities that bore you. You carefully curate your politics, your aesthetics, your ambitions, your humor, shaping and reshaping them in response to the perceived expectations of your audience. Here is the devastating irony. This strategy doesn't even work. People can feel inauthenticity. Not always consciously and not always immediately, but over time, the performance becomes transparent. The relationships you build on the false self are relationships built on a lie. You become surrounded by people who like a version of you that doesn't exist. Every compliment lands hollow because you know it isn't for you. It's for the character you've been playing. Meanwhile, the research of social psychologist Dr. Robin Dunbar offers a statistic that should genuinely reorient your priorities. Human beings are neurologically capable of maintaining meaningful relationships with approximately 150 people. In a country of 330 million, that means the overwhelming majority of the people whose imaginary opinions you're allowing to govern your choices are completely irrelevant to your actual life. You're letting strangers veto your dreams. You're working exhausting hours to earn money to buy things you don't really need to impress people you don't actually like. You're staying quiet in rooms where your voice is needed. You're playing small in a life that is begging you to expand. Understanding how the cage was built is the first essential step because it reveals something crucial. The bars were never real. They were constructed from fear and conditioned response and ancient survival wiring that has no legitimate claim on your modern life. Seeing them clearly is the beginning of walking through them. The price you're paying right now. Most people who are trapped in the approval cycle don't feel trapped. That's what makes it so insidious. The cage doesn't feel like a cage. It feels like prudence, like maturity, like being responsible and realistic. The costs are invisible in the moment, but compounding relentlessly beneath the surface of every choice. The first cost is what economists call opportunity cost. But in the context of approval seeking, it reaches dimensions that pure economics can't capture. Every time you don't speak up, don't start the project, don't end the relationship, don't take the leap, you close a door. And doors don't just lead to single rooms. They lead to corridors that lead to entire wings of possibility that you will never enter. Think about compound interest. That powerful mathematical principle that made Warren Buffett his fortune. A single decision made authentically today doesn't just change today. It creates ripple effects across months, years, decades. The authentic conversation you avoid doesn't cost you just that conversation. It costs you the relationship that conversation would have deepened. The business you don't launch doesn't cost you just that business. It costs you the network, the learning, the confidence, the identity shift that business would have produced. The second cost is the energy drain of continuous performance. Maintaining a false self is genuinely exhausting in a way that is physiologically measurable. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's landmark research on ego depletion demonstrated that self-regulation depletes a finite cognitive resource, what he called willpower. Every time you monitor your words, calibrate your expressions, suppress your actual reactions, and manufacture approved ones, you are spending from an account that has a real limit. This is why people who spend their days in performance, people pleasers, chronic approval seekers, often report coming home completely depleted, unable to engage meaningfully with the people and projects they actually care about. They have spent their entire reserves on the performance. There is nothing left for real living. The third cost is the corruption of your inner compass. The human being has an internal navigation system, a felt sense of what is right, what matters, what brings genuine aliveness. Psychologists call it intuition. Athletes call it instinct. Spiritual traditions call it many things. Whatever name you give it, it requires regular use to remain reliable. When you consistently make decisions based on what others might think, rather than what you actually feel and value, this instrument gets degraded. The signal weakens. You begin to genuinely lose track of your own preferences, your own desires, your own truth. This is why so many professionally successful Americans report feeling strangely empty. They have accumulated every external marker of a good life while completely losing contact with their own interiority. The fourth cost is the quality of your relationships. When you present a false self to the world, you attract people who respond to that false self. This creates a particularly cruel trap. You build a social life that feels populated, but is actually profoundly lonely because no one in it actually knows you. The conversations feel flat. The connections feel transactional. The friendships feel like performances you're too exhausted to maintain, but too afraid to abandon. The fifth cost, and this one is almost never discussed, is the erosion of self-respect. Each time you choose what others might think over what you actually believe, you send a message to your own subconscious. I am not trustworthy enough to make my own decisions. I need external verification before I can act. The cumulative effect of thousands of these messages over years is a deep, quiet form of self-contempt that manifests as chronic anxiety, imposter syndrome, and the pervasive sense that you are somehow fundamentally inadequate. The sixth cost is perhaps the most consequential, the ceiling it places on your potential. Greatness in every domain requires risk. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood, criticized, mocked, and dismissed, and to continue anyway. If you need universal approval to function, you will never discover what you're actually capable of. You will live the entirety of your one life in the safe middle of the bell curve, surrounded by people who are also playing it safe, telling each other that this is wisdom rather than what it actually is, a collective agreement to remain mediocre. These 6 costs don't announce themselves dramatically. They accumulate quietly over years, like a slow bleed that never quite becomes an emergency but drains you of everything that makes life worth living. By the time most people recognize them, decades have passed. But you are reading this now, and now is when it changes. The neuroscience of the trap. To dismantle a machine, you need to understand its mechanics. The approval-seeking mechanism is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It is a sophisticated neurological system with deep evolutionary roots. And understanding those roots is what allows you to step outside them. Here is the central fact that changes everything. Your brain evolved in a fundamentally different world than the one you actually inhabit. For roughly 99% of human evolutionary history, we lived in small, interdependent bands where social rejection was not a metaphor for emotional discomfort. It was a literal sentence of death. The person who was cast out died alone, so evolution built a powerful solution, a brain that treats social threat with the same urgency it treats physical danger. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, sometimes called the alarm system, does not distinguish between a tiger in the bushes and a colleague who might disapprove of your idea in a meeting. Both activate the same stress cascade. Cortisol floods the system. The heart rate rises. Blood is diverted from the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, to the muscles, the fighting or running brain. This is why you sometimes say exactly the wrong thing in a high-stakes conversation. You are literally less capable of complex thought in those moments, because evolution prepared you to run, not to deliberate. Stanford neuroscientist Dr. Robert Sapolsky has documented one of the most fascinating and troubling aspects of human neurology. We are the only species on the planet capable of activating full stress responses through pure imagination. A gazelle only runs from an actual lion. We run from hypothetical ones, imaginary future conversations, possible reactions, scenarios we've constructed entirely in our own minds that may never occur. This means that at 3 in the morning when you're lying awake catastrophizing about what someone might have meant by that comment, your body is experiencing genuine stress, cortisol, elevated heart rate, inflammatory response. The physiological machinery of danger is fully operational, responding to something that doesn't exist outside your skull. The approval-seeking loop also engages the brain's reward circuitry in ways that neurologically parallel addiction. When you receive positive social feedback, dopamine is released, the same neurotransmitter activated by cocaine, gambling wins, and alcohol. The same intermittent reinforcement schedule that makes slot machines so compulsively difficult to stop. Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. And the unpredictability is what makes the behavior compulsive. Governs your relationship with social validation. There is also the negativity bias, a deeply conserved feature of human cognition that causes the brain to give approximately 4 to 5 times more weight to potential negative information than to equivalent positive information. This made sense on the savannah. Missing one dangerous threat could kill you, while missing 10 positive opportunities was merely unfortunate. But in your current life, this bias causes you to obsessively rehearse the small percentage of people who might reject you while essentially ignoring the much larger percentage who respond well. Dr. Kristen Neff's research at the University of Texas has shown that people who practice self-compassion, treating themselves with the same basic decency they would extend to a struggling friend, are measurably more resilient, more creative, and more productive than people trapped in self-criticism and shame. But the evolutionary programming pushes hard in the opposite direction, driving you toward harsh self-monitoring as a strategy to avoid the social mistakes that once meant death. Here is the liberating reframe. None of this is your fault, and none of it is permanent. The brain is neuroplastic. It rewires through experience. The pathways that were carved by years of approval seeking can be replaced by new pathways built through consistent, authentic action. This is not metaphor. It is neuroscience. When you repeatedly choose authenticity over approval, you literally restructure the physical architecture of your brain. The threat response diminishes. The reward circuits reorganize. The alarm becomes quieter, but you have to do the work. Understanding the mechanism is necessary but not sufficient. The next chapters are about the practice, the voice that wants you small. When you begin to move toward authentic living, you will encounter resistance, not from outside, from inside. Your own mind will become your most sophisticated adversary. Understanding the specific forms this internal resistance takes is not an optional intellectual exercise. It is the difference between sustainable transformation and another cycle of inspiration followed by retreat. The first and most common form is rationalization. The human brain is extraordinarily good at constructing logical-sounding justifications for emotionally motivated decisions. When you're about to take an authentic risk, your mind doesn't say, "I'm scared of what people will think." It says, "I'm being responsible. I'm being practical. I'm not being impulsive." These thoughts feel like wisdom. They feel like the voice of mature, measured judgment. They are, in almost every case, fear with a college degree. The test is simple. Would you be giving this careful, considered advice to a friend who is about to take the same risk? If the answer is no, if you would be cheering that friend on, excited about the possibilities, then the voice is not wisdom. It is the survival mechanism doing its job. The second form is emotional overwhelm. As you move toward authentic expression, your nervous system may respond with genuine anxiety, rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, a sense of impending social catastrophe. These sensations are so uncomfortable and so convincing that most people interpret them as warning signals. Stop. This is wrong. Turn back. In fact, these sensations are almost always the feeling of growth, not the feeling of danger. Your brain is activating old threat circuitry in response to a new behavior, and the discomfort is the process of those old pathways being disrupted and replaced. The third form is identity protection. Over years of approval seeking, your brain has built an identity around this pattern. The stories might sound like, "I'm a thoughtful person who considers everyone's feelings. I'm professionally careful. I'm socially aware." When you challenge these patterns, the brain experiences it as a threat to your fundamental sense of self, and it will fight to maintain consistency with what it believes you are. This is why profound personal change can feel, bizarrely, like a kind of death. The reality is that your personality is far more fluid than almost anyone believes. The traits that feel most permanent, most essentially you, are frequently just habits practiced so thoroughly they've acquired the solidity of bedrock. Bedrock that can, with sustained and deliberate effort, be reshaped. The fourth form of resistance is what might be called hypervigilant social scanning. As soon as you begin to act more authentically, your threat detection system shifts into high alert, scanning compulsively for evidence of negative judgment. A friend seems slightly distracted during a conversation, and your brain files it as disapproval. A colleague's email is shorter than usual, and your system catalogs it as a sign that they're pulling away. Neutral information gets systematically interpreted as confirmation of your worst fears. The fifth, and perhaps most elegant form of resistance, is perfectionism. Your mind will convince you that you need to feel ready before you can begin, that you need to be confident before you can act confident, certain before you can take a risk, fearless before you can do the frightening thing. This sounds reasonable. It is a trap. Readiness is not a precondition for authentic action. Readiness is a consequence of authentic action, repeated over time until it becomes familiar. Courage is not the absence of fear. Every person who has ever done anything genuinely brave has done it while afraid. The fear doesn't go away first. You move toward the frightening thing, and the fear diminishes as you move, sometimes immediately, sometimes over weeks or months. But it never ever diminishes in advance. The most important thing to understand about internal resistance is that it is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that you are pressing against the edges of your current operating range. The discomfort is the boundary becoming permeable. The anxiety is the alarm system recalibrating. The resistance is the system working, not failing. Rewriting the story of other people's opinions. The most foundational shift in breaking free from approval seeking is a change in how you understand other people's opinions. Most people unconsciously treat opinions like facts, objective assessments of reality that must be taken seriously, responded to, and ideally corrected when negative. This understanding is the engine of the approval trap, and it is completely wrong. Every opinion anyone has ever held about you is first and last a reflection of them. It is assembled from their history, their wounds, their values, their current emotional state, their own unresolved fears, and the particular lens through which they've been taught to see the world. When someone criticizes your choices, they are not offering you a satellite view of objective reality. They are showing you their internal landscape. Consider a simple illustration. Show 10 different people in America the same piece of abstract art. One will find it profound. One will find it pretentious. One will find it beautiful. One will find it meaningless. The painting hasn't changed. What changes is the person encountering it. The same principle, operating with precisely the same power, applies to every perception anyone forms of you. This means that universal approval is not just difficult to achieve. It is a logical impossibility. The same qualities that make you extraordinary to one person will make you threatening, irritating, or incomprehensible to another. The directness that your best friend loves will make your conflict-avoidant colleague uncomfortable. The ambition that inspires your mentor will make your underachieving family member defensive. Your authenticity cannot simultaneously satisfy mutually contradictory filters. There is also a phenomenon that deserves serious attention: the way authentic people can trigger defensive reactions in those who are still imprisoned by approval seeking. When you start living freely, pursuing your goals without apology, expressing genuine opinions, making choices based on your own values, you become a mirror for the compromises others have made. Your courage reflects their accommodation. Your authenticity exposes their performance. This is why, when you begin to grow, some people in your life will become critical rather than supportive. They will frame their criticism as concern. "I just don't want you to get hurt," or "I'm worried you're not being realistic." But what they are actually experiencing is threat. Your growth is making their stagnation impossible to ignore. This is not a reason to abandon your growth. It is information about where they are in their own journey. One of the most immediately useful cognitive tools for dissolving approval seeking is what I call the source interrogation. Before giving any opinion real weight, interrogate its source. Who is this person? What is their expertise in this area? What are their actual accomplishments in the domain they're critiquing? What might be motivating their judgment? Concern for you or something else entirely? Psychologist Thomas Gilovich of Cornell University documented a phenomenon called the spotlight effect, the human tendency to dramatically overestimate how much other people notice and think about our behavior. In study after study, people estimated that their embarrassing moments, unusual clothing, and social stumbles were observed and remembered by far more people than actually noticed them at all. The audience that feels so real, so present, so relentlessly judgmental in your mind is mostly a fiction. People are overwhelmingly preoccupied with their own performances, their own fears, their own narratives. This is not permission to be reckless about your impact on others. There is an important distinction between not needing others' approval and not caring about others' well-being. You can be genuinely compassionate, genuinely interested in how your choices affect the people you love, without being controlled by their reactions. Compassion and sovereignty are not contradictory. They are complementary capacities of a mature, integrated adult. The question to begin asking, starting now, starting today, is not what will they think. The question is, what do I actually believe is right here? The shift seems small. The effects are seismic. The 4 pillars of authentic living. Understanding. Why approval seeking is destructive is necessary. Having the right mindset about other people's opinions is necessary. But neither is sufficient without a concrete structural framework for actually living differently. The following 4 pillars form the architecture of a life built on genuine self-direction rather than external validation. The first pillar is radical self-acceptance, not the shallow, decorative version promoted by wellness brands, the real thing, which is both simpler and more demanding. Radical self-acceptance means seeing yourself completely, your strengths, your limitations, your past choices, your current failures, your unfulfilled potential, and refusing to allow any of it to diminish your fundamental worth as a human being. This is not the same as complacency. It is not deciding that you're perfect as you are, and therefore nothing needs to change. It is understanding that growth and self-worth are not in competition. You can simultaneously acknowledge that you have significant areas to develop and maintain unshakable confidence in your inherent value. In fact, this is the only foundation on which genuine growth becomes possible, because when your self-worth is not on the line, you can look at your limitations clearly without being devastated by them. The practice of radical self-acceptance begins with an inventory. Sit down and write out everything you are ashamed of, everything you've been hiding, every way you believe you fall short. Don't rush this. The purpose is not to wallow. It is to bring everything into the light where it can be examined rather than feared. For each item on your list, ask, does this make me less worthy as a human being? The answer, examined honestly, is always no. The second pillar is values-based decision-making. The approval seeker makes decisions by consulting an imaginary external panel. What would people think? The authentic person makes decisions by consulting an internal compass. What do I actually stand for? This requires, first, that you know clearly what your values are. Most people have never done this work. They have a vague sense of what matters to them, but they have never sat down and identified their core values explicitly enough to use them as decision-making tools. Try this. If you were at the end of your life, looking back, what would you need to have been true about how you lived to feel that it had been well spent? What qualities would you most want associated with your name? What principles would you never violate, even under significant pressure? The answers to these questions are your values. Once you have this clarity, decision-making becomes dramatically simpler. You don't need to consult the imaginary jury. You consult your compass. Does this choice align with what I stand for? That's the question. It won't always produce the most popular answer, but it will reliably produce your answer. The third pillar is emotional self-regulation. Your emotions are real and important. They carry vital information about your internal state, your values, and your needs. But they are not facts about external reality. And they are not commanders. They are advisors. The approval seeker is governed by anxiety about potential judgment. The authentic person can feel that anxiety, acknowledge it, and choose their response rather than being automatically driven by it. Emotional regulation is a learnable skill. It begins with what mindfulness practitioners call the pause. the deliberate insertion of space between stimulus and response. Someone says something critical. Instead of the automatic defensive reaction, you breathe. You notice what you're feeling. You ask, what is this emotion telling me? Is it giving me useful information, or is it the old threat response activating? Then you choose your response from that place of perspective. The fourth pillar is strategic nonconformity. This is not rebellion for its own sake, not the adolescent performance of not caring about what anyone thinks, which is actually just approval seeking with a different target. Strategic nonconformity means making conscious, deliberate choices about when to align with social norms and when to depart from them, based always on your values and goals, never on compulsion or fear. In Solomon Ash's famous conformity experiments, subjects gave obviously incorrect answers to simple visual perception questions just to align with a group consensus. But a small subset of participants maintained their independent judgment, even under sustained social pressure. What separated them? Not intelligence, not education. What separated them was the practiced habit of trusting their own perceptions, of treating their direct experience as more authoritative than social consensus. These four pillars, radical self-acceptance, values-based decision-making, emotional self-regulation, and strategic nonconformity, are not sequential. They reinforce and amplify each other. Self-acceptance creates the security to act on your values. Values provide direction for your choices. Emotional regulation keeps you stable under pressure. Strategic nonconformity ensures your authenticity is expressed in action, not just in intention. Building the immunity. The metaphor of immunity is precise here, not decorative. Just as your immune system builds its defenses through graduated exposure to pathogens, your psychological resistance to external judgment builds through graduated exposure to authentic action, starting small, increasing gradually, until things that once felt terrifying feel merely unremarkable. The first technique is what might be called opinion inoculation. This is the deliberate practice of small, low-stakes authentic acts, not because they are particularly important in themselves, but because they train the nervous system to associate authenticity with safety rather than danger. Order the unusual thing on the menu. Disagree with a minor point in a casual conversation. Wear the item of clothing you love but have been avoiding. Take a route to work that no one would expect. These acts feel trivial. They are not. Each one is a small data point that challenges your brain's catastrophic predictions. Each one asks what actually happened when you stepped outside the approved lane. Almost always the answer is nothing terrible. People didn't notice, or they noticed and didn't care, or they noticed and respected it. This real-world feedback is the most powerful argument available against your threat detection system's exaggerated claims. The second technique is the criticism audit. Most approval seekers are so allergic to any negative feedback that even the word criticism triggers a stress response. This avoidance makes criticism more powerful, not less, because anything that must be avoided acquires enormous psychological weight. The antidote is to actively seek constructive feedback in controlled contexts, learning to receive it without being destabilized. Ask a trusted colleague for honest input on your work. Ask a close friend to tell you about a pattern they've noticed that might not be serving you. When you receive criticism, practice sitting with it without immediately defending or deflecting. Ask yourself, with genuine curiosity, is there something true here? Sometimes the answer will be yes, and you'll have received something genuinely valuable. Sometimes the answer will be no, and you'll have practiced the far more important skill of receiving criticism without taking it as a verdict on your worth. The third technique is deliberate visibility. The approval seeker's instinct is to hide, to keep the authentic self out of sight where it can't be judged. The cure is the opposite: gradual, intentional revelation. Share a real opinion in a conversation where you'd normally play it safe. Mention an interest or passion you typically keep quiet. Disagree respectfully with someone you typically accommodate. Let your actual personality show in a professional context where you'd normally perform. The goal is not to be provocative. The goal is to stop exhausting yourself with the management of an image that isn't you. When you reveal your actual self gradually in contexts of increasing stakes, two things typically happen. The conversations become dramatically more interesting, and the relationships become dramatically more real. The fourth technique is cognitive redirection. When you notice yourself beginning to spiral into what will they think, interrupt the spiral immediately and redirect your attention to what you can actually control. Ask instead, what do my values tell me to do here? What would I choose if no one would ever know? What would my best self decide? This redirection is not suppression. You're not pushing the anxiety down. You're simply choosing where to direct your mental resources. The fifth technique is the confidence ledger. Every time you act authentically despite fear, record it. Keep an actual written record, in a journal, on your phone, anywhere that persists. Document the authentic action, and then document what actually happened. Over time, this ledger becomes a body of evidence against the threat system's predictions. Your brain is wired to remember and amplify negative outcomes. The ledger counterbalances this bias with the accumulated proof of authentic actions that led to neutral or positive results. The sixth and final technique is social environment curation. You cannot build immunity to judgment while spending most of your time with people who judge constantly, who make you feel that you must perform to belong, who reward conformity and punish deviation. Gradually, you don't need to do it dramatically or all at once. Shift your social investment toward people who model authenticity, who are doing their own work, who offer genuine support rather than subtle control. This is not rejection of anyone. It is prioritization of what serves your growth. The art of receiving criticism. Criticism is coming. This is not pessimism. It is arithmetic. Anyone who creates anything, leads anything, says anything that matters, stands for anything worth standing for, will face criticism. The variable is not whether it will come. The variable is whether you will be prepared to receive it in a way that extracts value and discards noise, without it destabilizing your fundamental trajectory. The first principle is emotional preparation. The deliberate cultivation of an expectation that criticism is a normal feature of an authentic life, not an aberration that signals error. The approval seeker is blindsided by criticism because they secretly believe that if they are careful, diplomatic, and good enough, they can avoid it entirely. This belief sets them up for devastation. The authentic person understands that criticism is the price of doing something meaningful. The second principle is source evaluation. Before you give any criticism real weight, assess its source. Critics fall into several functionally distinct categories. Constructive critics offer feedback from a place of genuine concern and relevant expertise. They've earned the right to influence you through the quality of their own work and the depth of their investment in your success. Competitive critics tear down rather than build up. Their criticism is not really about you. It's about managing their own discomfort with your progress. Ignorant critics judge from outside a context they don't fully understand. Their confidence is inversely proportional to their actual knowledge. Malicious critics are not interested in truth at all. Engaging with them is simply a waste of the finite resource of your attention. The third principle is content analysis, the disciplined separation of useful information from emotional packaging. People often deliver legitimate feedback in harsh or clumsy language, especially when they're frustrated or passionately invested. Your job is to extract the signal from the noise. Ask yourself, if I remove all the judgmental language and focus on the specific behavior or outcome being discussed, what is this person actually saying? Is there something actionable here? The fourth principle is the 24-hour rule. When criticism triggers a strong emotional reaction, your initial response is almost certainly not your wisest one. The stress cascade that criticism activates literally impairs your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for nuanced, considered judgment. Give yourself at minimum 24 hours before responding to any criticism that you feel strongly about. During that period, feel what you feel, process with a trusted person if needed, and do not act from your first emotional state. The fifth principle is strategic response selection. Once you've evaluated the source, analyzed the content, and processed your emotional reaction, you have four basic choices. You can learn and adjust. If the criticism contains legitimate, actionable information that aligns with your values and goals, you integrate it. You can clarify and educate. If the criticism is based on misunderstanding, you can provide additional context. You can hold your position. If the criticism is substantively wrong or comes from a source without standing, you maintain your course. Or you can simply move on, giving a criticism no response and no further mental real estate. Perhaps most importantly, every time you receive criticism and remain intact, every time you process it, extract whatever value it contains, discard the rest, and continue on your path, you build genuine psychological resilience. You prove to your own subconscious that the thing you feared most is survivable. And what is survivable loses its power to control you. The people who criticized the Wright brothers are remembered by no one. Orville and Wilbur are remembered by everyone. The people who told Oprah she was wrong for television are anonymous. Oprah built an empire. History belongs to the people who stayed focused on their mission long enough for the results to speak so clearly that the critics had nothing left to say. Building unshakable confidence. The confidence that comes from living authentically is qualitatively different from the fragile ego management that approval seekers mistake for confidence. Approval-based confidence is inherently unstable. It requires constant replenishment from external sources and collapses whenever that supply is interrupted. Authentic confidence is load-bearing. It supports you through criticism, failure, rejection, and ambiguity precisely because its foundation is internal. The first foundation of authentic confidence is radical self-honesty. Not the performance of positivity that social media promotes, but the willingness to see yourself clearly and completely without being destroyed by what you see. This sounds simple. It is the work of a lifetime. People who try to build confidence through self-deception, through affirmations that don't match their genuine self-assessment, through narrative inflation of their accomplishments, through the careful avoidance of any feedback that might challenge the story they're telling themselves, produce what psychologists call defensive self-esteem. This variety of self-esteem is not merely fragile, it is actively harmful. It prevents the honest self-assessment required for genuine growth, and it requires such constant maintenance that it depletes the very resources needed for authentic achievement. True confidence emerges from a different starting point entirely. I see myself clearly, including my limitations, and I am not less worthy because of them. I am a work in progress, and I am committed to the progress. This orientation, honest, humble, and fundamentally secure, is what allows the confident person to ask the questions approval seekers avoid, to fail in public without permanent damage, and to grow with a speed that the self-deceptive can never match. The second foundation is genuine competence development. Confidence without capability is mere bravado. and the subconscious knows the difference. When you develop real skill in areas that matter to you, your confidence has something to stand on. You don't need to be the world's best. You need to be genuinely capable of doing what you're attempting to do and to know it. This requires the willingness to be temporarily bad at things, to be publicly imperfect while learning, to prioritize growth over appearance, the very qualities that approval seekers avoid. Stanford psychologist Dr. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset documented the profound difference between people who believe their abilities are fixed and people who believe they are developable through effort. Growth-minded people, those who can look at a failure and ask, what can I learn from this rather than what does this say about my permanent worth, consistently outperform fixed mindset people over time because they remain open to the experiences that produce competence. The third foundation is what might be called value alignment integrity, the practice of keeping your external behavior consistently aligned with your internal values. Every time you act in alignment with your values, you make a deposit in your self-respect account. Every time you betray your values for external approval, you make a withdrawal. People who chronically people-please are, in this sense, continuously indebted to their own self-respect, and the psychic interest on that debt compounds into the low-grade self-contempt that underlies so much chronic anxiety and emptiness. The fourth foundation is emotional mastery, the development of a stable interior regardless of external weather. Confident people are not people who never feel negative emotions. They are people whose well-being is not dependent on the absence of negative emotions. They can feel fear without being controlled by it. They can feel disappointment without being destroyed by it. They can feel criticism without being defined by it. The fifth foundation is purpose orientation, the connection of your daily choices to something larger than immediate comfort or social approval. When you are clear about what you are building and why it matters, the opinions of people who neither share your vision nor understand your path carry negligible weight. Purpose is not something you find. It is something you construct. Through the disciplined exploration of what genuinely matters to you, what problems you are uniquely positioned to address, and what work you would do even if no one ever praised you for it. These 5 foundations, honest self-perception, genuine competence, value alignment, emotional mastery, and purpose orientation, produce a confidence that doesn't require the morning headlines of external validation to maintain. It requires only your own consistent alignment with who you've decided to be. Authenticity and the real-world principles become real only when they survive contact with actual life. With the Monday morning meeting, the Sunday dinner with family, the 4th date when you realize you've been performing, the moment your boss disagrees with an idea you believe in, the comment section under something you posted. This chapter is about that contact. In professional environments, the pressure toward conformity can feel overwhelming because the stakes feel existential. Your livelihood appears to depend on others' approval. This perception is real and it deserves respect, but it also deserves examination. The most effective professionals are almost universally those who bring something genuine to their work, not those who are the most agreeable, not those who never push back. Those who think independently, contribute original perspectives, and maintain the courage of their professional convictions even when the room pushes back. Before a high-stakes professional interaction, try this. Instead of asking, how can I come across well, ask, what is the most genuinely useful thing I can contribute to this conversation? The second question almost always produces better professional outcomes, and it happens to be the question that aligns with your authentic contribution rather than your performed persona. When you disagree with something in a professional setting and choose to say so, the specific language matters. Compare these two approaches. Version 1. I'm sorry, maybe I'm wrong, but I just wanted to throw out a thought. Feel free to ignore it. What if we considered another approach? Version 2. I see it differently. Here's my perspective and my reasoning. What am I missing? The second version respects both yourself and your colleagues enough to be clear. It invites genuine dialogue. The first version is a preemptive apology for the crime of having a perspective. Social and family environments present distinct challenges because the approval-seeking patterns here are often the oldest and most deeply grooved. Family members have known you in your people-pleasing mode for decades. They have unconsciously organized their expectations around your accommodation. When you begin to set limits, express genuine opinions, make different choices, they may experience this not as your growth, but as a form of abandonment. This is particularly acute in American families where holiday gatherings become theaters of old dynamics, where roles assigned in childhood persist stubbornly into middle age. The technique that works best here is combining warmth with clarity. I love you, and I'm not going to agree about this. I understand this is different from what you'd hope for, and this is the choice that's right for me. You're not attacking anyone. You're not rejecting anyone. You're simply declining to participate in a dynamic that requires the suppression of your authentic self. In romantic relationships, the temptation to shapeshift toward whatever you believe your partner wants can be almost irresistible, especially in early stages when the fear of rejection is acute. But relationships built on performed selves are built on quicksand. The inevitable moment arrives when the performance becomes unsustainable, and the person who has fallen in love with your character finds themselves living with someone they don't fully recognize. Authentic romantic relationships require, as a non-negotiable starting condition, the willingness to be seen as you actually are, and to risk that not being enough for a particular person. This sounds frightening. It is, in practice, deeply liberating. When you show yourself genuinely and someone chooses you anyway, when they choose you precisely because of who you are, rather than despite it, the security that results is unlike anything that can be built on performance. Online, the challenges are particular. The potential audience is vast. The feedback is immediate. The reward circuits are maximally engaged, and the culture specifically rewards the most performed, curated, optimized version of the self. The key insight is that social media is a tool with a default setting, and that default setting is catastrophically bad for psychological health. You can use the tool differently. You can choose to post what actually reflects your perspective, your questions, your genuine experience, not what you've calculated will produce the most positive response. Every domain of your life, professional, personal, romantic, digital, offers daily practice opportunities for authentic living. The transformation doesn't require grand gestures. It requires the accumulation of small, authentic choices, made consistently over time, until authenticity becomes not an effort, but a habit. How your relationships will transform. When you begin living authentically, your social world will reorganize. This is not a side effect, it is a feature. The reorganization will feel uncomfortable at times, and it will produce losses as well as gains. Understanding what to expect from this process is essential for navigating it without reverting to people-pleasing as a way to stop the discomfort. The first category of change involves people who were invested in your accommodating behavior. These relationships, some of them quite close, some of them long-standing, were built on a dynamic where your compliance was an unspoken condition of the connection. When that compliance is withdrawn, the relationship faces a crisis. Some of these people will adapt and discover that they actually prefer the real you, that the relationship can become something more honest and more interesting than it was. These are worth preserving and deepening. Others will escalate the pressure, guilt, emotional manipulation, withdrawal of warmth, accusations that you've changed or become selfish. These responses revealed that the relationship was never really about you at all. It was about your usefulness. The second category involves people who simply never knew the real you. Long-term colleagues, old friends, even family members who have been engaging with your performed self for so long that your actual self has become invisible. When you begin revealing who you actually are, their reactions will vary widely. Some will be delighted. They'll tell you they always sensed there was more to you, that they're glad you feel comfortable enough to be real. Others will be confused or resistant. They've become comfortable with the character they know, and any deviation feels threatening. The third category involves entirely new people, relationships that become possible only once you're visible as your actual self. The authentic you will attract people who the performed you could never have found, because those people were looking for something real, and you weren't offering it. These new connections often form quickly and go deep, because they are grounded in truth from the first conversation, rather than slowly building a fiction that eventually collapses. In romantic contexts, the shift is particularly pronounced. When you stop being desperate for connection, when you approach dating from a foundation of self-sufficiency rather than need, you become dramatically more selective and dramatically more attractive at the same time. Neediness is not subtle. It communicates itself through 100 microsignals in every interaction. It's opposite. The genuine indifference to whether any particular person approves of you, combined with real openness to genuine connection, is magnetic in ways that no amount of charm coaching can manufacture. Professionally, authenticity tends to create two opposing effects simultaneously. It earns deep respect from people with their own strong sense of self, and it creates friction with those who prefer their colleagues compliant. The net effect over time is almost universally positive, because the people who value your genuine contribution are typically the ones worth working with, and the friction with those who preferred your compliance eventually resolves as they adjust, leave, or reveal themselves as relationships not worth maintaining. The deepest change is in your relationship with yourself. As you stop performing for external approval, you will need to develop the capacity for self-validation, the ability to meet your own emotional needs, to acknowledge your own growth, to comfort your own distress without requiring someone else to do it. This can feel lonely initially. It is actually the foundation of genuine independence. When you can be with yourself, fully without judgment, you are never truly alone, and you are never held hostage by the availability or approval of another person. The goal is not a large social circle. The goal is a real one. 5 people who know you, actually know you, are worth more than 500 who know the performance. Making it last, the principles of sustainable change. Transformation that doesn't last is expensive in the most painful possible way. It costs you the hope that real change is possible. Understanding how sustainable personal change actually works, not as wishful thinking but as neuroscience and behavioral psychology, is what separates the people who transform their lives from the people who perpetually restart the same cycle. The first principle is the expectation of setbacks. Approval-seeking patterns were built over years or decades of reinforcement. They will not dissolve in weeks. You will have days, sometimes clusters of days, when you revert to the old patterns. When you say yes to something, You meant to decline when you suppress an opinion you should have expressed, when you catch yourself refreshing for validation rather than proceeding with the work. These are not failures. They are data. They tell you where you are most vulnerable, what triggers activate the old programming most powerfully, where you need to direct more conscious attention. The most destructive response to a setback is the all-or-nothing narrative. I said yes when I meant no, so the transformation isn't working. So I might as well stop trying. This narrative is the approval-seeking mechanism defending itself. Progress is not perfection. Progress is a direction, maintained over time, through repeated imperfect efforts. Your recovery speed after setbacks, not the absence of setbacks, is the actual measure of your progress. The second principle is systematic accountability. Sustainable change is almost never solo work. You need external structures that hold you to your intentions when your internal resolve is depleted. This might be a therapist who understands and supports authentic living. It might be a coach who challenges your rationalizations. It might be a peer community of people who are doing similar work. It might simply be a trusted friend who has agreed to offer honest feedback when they observe you reverting to old patterns. The third principle is skill development. Authenticity is not merely an attitude. It is a set of learnable, practicable skills. The skill of setting limits with warmth and clarity. The skill of expressing disagreement without aggression or apology. The skill of receiving criticism without becoming its victim. The skill of sitting with social discomfort without immediately resolving it through accommodation. These skills improve with deliberate practice and deteriorate without it. The fourth principle is environmental design. Your environment, the people you spend time with, the media you consume, the conversations you participate in, will either support or undermine your commitment to authentic living. This is not about willpower. It is about architecture. Willpower is finite and unreliable. Environment is persistent and cumulative. Design your environment to make authenticity the path of least resistance rather than the path of greatest effort. The fifth principle is identity consolidation. The gradual shift in self-concept from someone who is trying to stop seeking approval to someone who simply doesn't need it. This identity shift is not something that can be forced. It emerges from the accumulation of authentic choices over time. Every time you act from your values rather than from fear of judgment, you strengthen the identity of a person who does that. Eventually, the question, "What will people think?" stops arising as the first question. It becomes a secondary consideration at most, one input among many, rather than the filter through which all decisions must pass. The sixth principle is patience with non-linearity. Change of this depth is not a straight line. It spirals. You will revisit the same patterns at deeper levels. A trigger that you thought you'd resolved will reactivate in a new context. This is not regression. It is integration at a deeper layer. The spiral is moving forward. It just doesn't look like forward from inside it. The final principle, and the one that tends to create the most sustainable momentum, is contribution. When you commit to helping others who are earlier in their own journey toward authentic living, your own authenticity becomes not merely a personal project, but a purpose. The accountability is different when the stakes extend beyond your own comfort. The resilience is different when your commitment serves something beyond yourself. The most powerful way to sustain your own transformation is to become someone whose transformation lights the way for others. What becomes possible? The case against caring what people think has so far been largely corrective, about removing the costs, dismantling the mechanisms, escaping the traps. This final chapter before the conclusion is about what becomes possible on the other side of that removal. because the freedom from approval seeking is not merely an absence, it is an opening. And what flows through that opening can be extraordinary. The first thing that changes is decision-making. It's speed, quality, and alignment with what actually matters to you. When you are no longer running every choice, through the imaginary jury, you can act from clarity with a directness that was simply not available before. The cognitive load of approval seeking, the constant background computation of how each choice will be perceived, is immense. When it lifts, the relief is physical. The mental space that opens up is something people describe consistently as one of the most immediately noticeable and valuable effects of authentic living. The second thing that changes is the velocity of personal and professional growth. When you are no longer afraid of looking incompetent during the learning process, you can acquire new skills at a dramatically accelerated pace. You can ask the questions that approval seekers suppress. You can attempt things publicly that might not work. You can fail without experiencing it as a verdict on your fundamental worth, and therefore you can fail faster, learn faster, and ultimately succeed at things that approval seekers never even attempt. The third thing that changes is your energy. The chronic depletion that comes from sustained performance is something most approval seekers have lived with so long they've normalized it. They believe it's just what adult life feels like. When the performance stops, the energy returns. People report sleeping better, feeling more physically vital, having reserves for the relationships and projects that actually matter. The resources that were being spent on impression management become available for actual living. The fourth thing that changes is your health, not metaphorically. The chronic stress produced by sustained approval seeking has documented measurable physiological effects: elevated cortisol, systemic inflammation, compromised immune function, disrupted sleep architecture, accelerated cellular aging. Authentic living, with its reduction in chronic social anxiety, produces measurable improvements in these markers. This is not a wellness slogan. It is physiology. The fifth thing that changes is the nature and quality of your creative output. Creativity requires a kind of cognitive safety, the freedom to generate without immediate self-censorship. Approval seeking is fundamentally incompatible with genuine creativity because it imposes the imaginary jury standards on the generative process itself, killing ideas before they can develop into anything. The most significant creative breakthroughs in every field have come from people who had, at least temporarily, suspended their concern with how the work would be received and attended only to what the work needed to be. The sixth thing that changes is the experience of success. For approval seekers, even genuine success doesn't feel fully real because it was achieved by the performed self rather than the authentic one. There is always the lurking awareness that the praise, the recognition, the achievement might evaporate if people really knew you. When you are living and working authentically, success lands differently. It feels earned, complete, yours, because it was achieved by the person you actually are. The seventh thing that changes is your impact on others, particularly on people who are still imprisoned by the need for approval. Authentic people change the social atmosphere around them. They give others implicit permission to be more honest, more direct, more real. The courage is genuinely contagious. Children who watch a parent live authentically develop a different relationship to their own self-expression than children who watch a parent perform. Colleagues who work alongside a genuinely authentic person report that the presence changes how they show up. And the eighth, the most profound of all, is the alignment between your internal experience and your external life. The approval seeker lives with a permanent low-grade schism. The self they project and the self they actually are exist in constant tension. This gap is the source of the pervasive emptiness that success can't fill, the exhaustion that rest doesn't cure, the loneliness that crowds can't resolve. When the gap closes, when who you are on the outside becomes who you are on the inside, the sense of integration, of wholeness, of finally being home in your own life, is unlike anything that external achievement has ever produced. The only question that matters. Now you've come a long way in these pages. You now understand, with a precision you didn't have when you began, exactly how the approval trap was constructed inside you through childhood conditioning, evolutionary wiring, social reinforcement, and the industrial weaponization of your brain's reward system by platforms that profit from your insecurity. You understand the costs you've been paying, the mechanisms that sustain the pattern, and the specific practices through which authentic living is built and maintained. All of that understanding is worth exactly nothing unless you do something with it. This is where most transformation attempts fail, not in understanding, but in the transition from understanding to action. People read books like this, feel genuinely moved and genuinely motivated, and then return to their lives and find that the familiar patterns have not moved an inch. 2 weeks later, they're back in the same dynamics, telling themselves the same stories, seeking the same approvals. The inspiration has dissipated, the urgency has faded, and the gravity of the old life has pulled them back to precisely where they started. The reason this happens is not weakness of will or insufficient motivation. The reason is that they tried to change their behavior without changing their identity. They tried to act differently while still fundamentally seeing themselves as an approval seeker. This doesn't work. Behavior that contradicts identity is always temporary. It requires constant effortful maintenance and collapses whenever the effort drops below the threshold required to sustain it. The transformation that lasts requires a different kind of decision, not a decision to behave differently, but a decision about who you are. Not, I am going to try to be less focused on what people think, but I am someone who lives from my own center. This distinction sounds subtle. It is the difference between a diet and a changed relationship with food. The difference between a fitness program and an identity as an athlete. The difference between an experiment in honesty and a life grounded in truth. The decision doesn't require certainty. It doesn't require readiness. It doesn't require the absence of fear. It requires only the willingness to act as that person, starting now with whatever is in front of you, and to act as that person again the next time, and the time after that, until the acting becomes being, and the being becomes undeniable. There is someone in your life right now whose honest opinion you've been withholding. There is a conversation you've been avoiding. There is a choice you've been deferring because you're waiting for permission that will never come from the source you've been waiting for. There is a version of yourself you've been keeping under lock and key, brought out only in private, certain that the world isn't ready for it. The world is not going to become more ready. The conditions are not going to become more perfect. The fear is not going to dissolve before you take the first step. This is how it works. You step, and then the fear becomes survivable, and then it becomes smaller. And then one day you look back and realize that the thing that imprisoned you for years was, all along, built from nothing more substantial than your own imagination. 5 years from now, one of two things will be true. Either you will look back on this moment as the turning point, the moment when you stopped living for an audience and started living for yourself, when the real life finally began, or you will be in exactly the same place you are now, perhaps a little more tired, a little more certain that this is just how it is, a little more distant from the person you could have become. The choice is made not once in a grand gesture, but 1,000 times a day in small moments that add up to everything. Will you say what you actually mean in this conversation? Will you make this choice based on what you value or based on what you fear? Will you let yourself be seen, imperfect and real, or will you spend another day managing the presentation? There is no audience worth the sacrifice of your authentic life. There is no approval worth the cost of your authentic self. There is no version of other people's opinions, no matter how loudly or consistently expressed, that matters more than your one irreplaceable, unrepeatable experience of being alive. The freedom of indifference is not emptiness. It is not callousness. It is not a fortress of isolation. It is a clearing, space finally for the real things, real connection, real work, real risk, real love, real failure, real triumph, real life. You have always had permission to live this way. You are the only one who could ever grant it. Consider it granted. Now go.